everybody. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for coming out tonight and joining us for this event. My name is Kelly Jo Brick. I'm the Vice Chair of the WGA Genre Committee and excited to be teamed up with the Asian American Writers Committee and Storyline Partners for tonight's event on futurism. A little about Genre Committee. We celebrate all things genre, from sci-fi to horror to comedy to action, you name it. We have a meeting coming up on Tuesday, August 2nd at 6 p.m. It's done virtually. We would love to have you come join us and get to know your fellow genre writers and help plan other events like this. You can find out more on the Guild calendar. So with that, I will hand it off to our friends at the Asian American Writers Committee, Christina and Aaron.
Hey everyone, I'm Christina Wu. I'm the new chair of the Asian American Writers Committee. I'm just really excited to welcome you all into this space and to listen to this, I think, really important conversation about futurism. So I'm going to throw it over to Aaron, my colleague.
Hi, so I'm Aaron Ho. I had a little to do with putting this together, but more importantly, I'm here to plug our next event. So keep an eye out for that. It's going to be on Wednesday, August 24th, and it's called Treat Yourself, Self-Care for Writers. And what that event is, it's basically, we're going to have some therapists slash writers, some academics, and basically talking about the importance of self-care, mental health, what sort of mental health issues commonly affect writers. You know, writing is stressful. We're a little more prone to anxiety and stuff like that. How do we cope with that? How do we, basically live to our best potential and be as productive as possible? So keep an eye out on that in the calendar and in the upcoming newsletters that'll be taking place again on Wednesday, August 24th. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to our Storyline Partners, to Sanaz, and she's going to continue on. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Hi, everyone. My name is Sanaz Adesafat, and I'm Program Director of Storyline Partners. We're a nonprofit collective of cultural consultants that actively advise and represent issues in community-based organizations. So if you ever need help in your writers' rooms, on your scripts, with characters, storylines, what have you, please hit us up. And with further ado, we are thrilled to have our moderator, Colin Costello, who is actively a part of the genre, the Black Writers Committee, and the Activities Committee. Thank you, Colin, for having us and for helping us on this talk today.
It is great to be here, Sanaz. Thanks for having me, because I am about to get down with some real talk with people I'm actually a little geeking out, which is really appropriate since it's the Comic-Con is a couple days away. But I am a huge fan of these people that we're about to talk to about basically, why is sci-fi so white? And they're going to tell us why, and hopefully me, and help us get it a little bit more diverse. I want to introduce my guests. I have Vice President of Development for FX, Megan Reid. And I have some wonderful writers, Carlos Cisco. You can read more about him, but he is right now on Star Trek Discovery. Huge fan, sir. Thank you for everything. Yeah. Jay Holtham, again, a huge fan, loved Supergirl, loved Handmaid's Tale, yep. And Javier Grillo, I don't want to butcher your last name, so I apologize, Marxuach. Did I butcher that?
Grillo-Marxuach, but
oh,
I've been living with that for 52 years, so we're good.
I tried, but I'm also a huge fan of Javi. He is one of the writers on my new favorite show, From. So yeah, I want to really get down to it because the whole topic of this is Afro-Futurism and Techno-Orientalism. And both of those terms, they are very interesting to me. And before we get into the definition of it, it seems like this is a much needed conversation, because as I was doing research for this, I even looked back over Afrofuturism in particular, since I'm biracial. And, I didn't know that Ralph Ellison, who wrote the original novel, The Invisible Man, was African American. Yet, you know, how many Invisible Man versions have we seen? And there hasn't been a brother in them. So, I mean, you know, I think this is a conversation that really needs to be explored, and I'm super excited to talk to you about it. Oh, and I am so sorry, I forgot the most important of our guests, David Rowe, who is an expert on Techno-Orientalism. And David, I apologize for that. But yeah, I would love to start with you just to define for us what is that really, because you even wrote a book on it.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. And thanks, Storyline and Sanaz, for inviting me. I'm really happy to be part of this discussion. I hope to learn a lot from our chat. So I've been asked to give sort of a brief primer on what Techno-Orientalism is, and I'm just going to give you some of the highlights, and I can just expand on some of the points during the discussion if people like that. But it's both an aesthetic and an ideology, and we're probably all familiar with the aesthetic, right? So think about someone had a background, but they're gone. Oh, so think about the neon glow and sci-fi of all these signs in Japanese, Chinese, Korean, against sort of the rainy backdrop of Tokyo, you know, filled with Asian characters in the background, not really saying much, right? So, you know, I'm thinking about Blade Runner, which really kind of invented the cinematic visual language for this, and it was aped many times over and copied by subsequent sci-fi films like Johnny Mnemonic, you know, Fifth Element elements of this, Altered Carbon, even the recent Obi-Wan Kenobi show had some elements of this as well, right? And so the question is, where did that aesthetic come from, right? And to understand the ideology of Techno-Orientalism, and it's really a manifestation of a long-standing anxiety by the West about the East, right? And we can't talk about Techno-Orientalism without talking about Orientalism. I'm not going to get too much into here. Some of you are probably familiar with it from your college courses, but you know, Orientalism is a way for the West to think about the East that renders it as forever pre-modern, right? Forever primitive, forever irrational, exotic, in contrast to the West's rationality, right? So, you know, think about 19th century discourses about, you know, the heathen Chinese or opium dens, general sentiment of dirtiness, disease, unknowability, inferiority, et cetera, right? Now, Techno-Orientalism as an iteration of Orientalism might seem to operate oppositionally, right? Because it's saying that the East is the future, right? It renders the East not as pre-modern, but hyper-modern, right? But there's a weird kind of double logic at play, right? The future might look like Tokyo, Shanghai, Seoul, but it's always the background, and it serves to undergird the protagonist's sense of alienation. And the protagonist is usually white, male, cisgender, straight, right? And this is not the future he wants. It's not a future he desires, right? And so you'll see examples of this contradiction in some sci-fi tropes where that futurity is always framed by pre-modernity. So like, how many times have you seen cyborg ninjas or android geishas or, you know, noodle stands on rocket ships for some strange reason, right? All these signifiers of pre-modern of the pre-modern East persist in the future, right? And just as a thought experiment, just think about how weird it would be if you're watching a bunch of sci-fi films and they all had robot cowboys and cyborg pilgrims slinging Soylent Green hot dogs at you for some reason. It'd be really conspicuous, right? But this visual language has become so internalized by the audience, it's really become invisible, right? And that invisibility is pernicious because it just keeps reinforcing the East's pre-modernity and primitivity, right? Without really our understanding why, right? And it's really a way to reconcile our fears and anxieties about the East's rise as a political, cultural force, economic force, and reinforce the West's monopoly on liberal humanism, right? We still maintain our superiority on our claim on humanity, right? So then the question becomes, well, why did we need Techno-Orientalism? Why did that turn from Orientalism to Techno-Orientalism really occur? Well, Orientalism had a problem in the 70s and 80s because Japan has started to rise as an economic threat and competitor, right? And it's a tiny island country, very few resources, completely decimated by World War II. But a couple decades later, here they are, you know, building premium consumer goods, electronics, beating the pants off GM and Ford. That does not compute, right? How can they possibly be equals? They are supposed to be forever pre-modern. Okay, so what do we do? Well, we have to build a rationale that explains that, right? So the East, they can compete and make good cars precisely because they're machinic, because they're affectless, because they're robotic, because they submit to groupthink, right? And they're not creative, right? They're good at copying. That's sort of the discourse. This should all sound familiar to you because it's been reapplied to China now, right? They're good at copying the IP that they've stolen from us, right? And it's precisely that unscrupulousness and inhumanity that makes them able to compete, right? And so a lot of sci-fi projects and maps this logic into visions of Asian futurities that's both extrapolation and explanation, right? And I'll just end by saying that this logic, makes for interesting TV and film, but really can have pernicious effects that lead not just to soul death, but literal death. And I'll end it there.
No, that's amazing. I remember hearing on NPR a few years ago in San Francisco for the first time, the amount of Asians entering kindergarten outnumbered white people, outnumbered white kids entering kindergarten. And, as you talk about Techno-Orientalism, I wonder, because as we're writers and we write about it, it's one thing, but almost if you flip it around to the audience, there's a group of white people out there, quite frankly, it would be a horror film for them if we got to that kind of a future. It's a scaring of a browning of America, quite frankly.
Well, I think what
Jay, I see you nodding. Oh, Javi.
I was going to say, I think that, if you look at Blade Runner, that's exactly what it's doing. I mean, Blade Runner is all about the oppressiveness of the 1980s future where Japan was going to take over everything.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that, you say it's a horror, you say it would be a horror movie, but it kind of is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and there's even that aspect, in Firefly, that sense of, the Chinese took over and the world sort of fell apart. I mean, and there are almost no, I'm not up on every single of the 15 episodes of Firefly, but there's like barely any Asian people in it. It's just a lot of white people.
There's one Asian American actor. And so the message is like, well, what happened in the future? Did they commit genocide? Are they all gone?
Yeah, but somehow everyone is speaking Chinese, but there's no Chinese people to be seen, and it's so frustrating, and so frustrating that so many of our visions of the future are still just white people doing everything, and all of the people of color and the women still shunted to the side.
Yeah, I mean, because when I did advertising on the side, when I was still doing advertising, I got to work at an Asian ad agency for a year. And there is so much beauty in the culture, but yet every time it's portrayed in the future, it's what you said, and it's crowded, it's dark, it's dank, and the people are cold.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, it's almost like subtly saying, because this is what'll happen if,
David, may I ask you a question to expand on something in your thesis about Techno-Futurism, Techno-Orientalism? A lot of the same material that you're talking about and others have a lot of sort of Western tropes in them as well. You see things like you mentioned robot cowboys selling hot dogs and things like that. And having just worked on Cowboy Bebop, that's very much something that's in my mind. So I'm curious, in your mind, is the difference just privilege and politics, or is there something that makes the representation of the West, how do the cliched representations of Western tropes in the same space sort of talk to or not talk to those of the ones that are pernicious?
Yeah, that's a great question, and this is sort of a half-formed, malformed thought, but the idea, I think, particularly germane to Cowboy Bebop, the idea of the Western frontier maps on nicely to sci-fi because it's about exploration in the untamed, wild space, right? And so you see that with Cowboy Bebop. I think what is different or complicated is that that kind of representation tends to be dominated by the West, right? And there are some problems in, I'm referencing an academic paper, and I won't get too wonky here, but It's a paper by Kumiko Saito, who talks about how Japanese culture industry in Japan kind of saw what was happening with the cyberpunkian Japanese representations in the West and really kind of jumped on it and started to speak back or ape some of the tropes, right? Because that fit into this, I mean, it was attempting to embrace, because that would kind of reinvigorate this notion of Japanese uniqueness and superiority, and Japan being formerly an empire that was kind of dangerous. And so you see a lot of sci-fi in Japan coming out that can be, somewhat can be critiqued sometimes for being uncritical in its adoption and adaptation of these tropes by the West, right? And so it depends on the context, right? But I think, because the Western culture industry so dominates the globe, it's not always on equal footing.
Mm-hmm. But there's also an interesting, I mean, just thinking about like the new run of Star Wars that we're talking about, which is so both Western and Eastern, because it's that interesting conversation of, cowboy movies to samurai stories to spaghetti westerns back into cowboys into sci-fi, and so it's all sort of blends in there, but through that process there is also that kind of whitewashing that happens with everything, and those threads are lost, and the people who really embody that, like so much of Obi-Wan, a show that I actually didn't watch. Sorry, everyone, not yet, haven't gotten there. But like, so much of The Mandalorian and all that is so, lone wolf and cub, and so like shot through with that, what we perceive of as that samurai ethic. And that also has become a big part of sci-fi, but again, separated entirely from any cultural context or given any sense of like why that particular thing exists in a galaxy far, far away, or 200 years into the future,
Well, go ahead, please.
Well, I was gonna say it's sort of interesting too, coming from Star Trek, and then mentioning Star Wars, like two properties that are kind of built on either like inclusivity and diversity, or rebelling against fascism, very inherently political properties. And you have a certain section of a fan base who has viewed them completely uncritically in that light, and has gone through this the entire cycle of these IPs, like from the 60s and 70s on, seeing themselves centered. Even though we are in a galaxy far, far away, filled with aliens, filled with any number of people, we can populate it however we want, we're still seeing white people centered. Same thing, I mean, Star Trek, obviously the new shows have changed course in a major way, but you look at the original series, which is, a very important series when it comes to groundbreaking, diverse stuff happening. The first interracial kiss, Uhura just in herself existing on the bridge is important, but it's still centered on the experience of three white men, primarily. And it's written primarily by white men throughout its, the run. And I say that with full respect for the giants whose shoulders I rest on now.
Or there's also that notion of kind of like plastic representation versus actual representation, right? Are you just kind of throwing a color, a gender, a sexuality on whatever your neutral is, which in America is a white straight cis dude? It's great being able to see these things, right? But how much specificity or actual thought about character, culture are you actually bringing to a story or a character?
Well, it's to a certain extent that we've almost been trained, and we have to almost untrain and retrain ourselves, that we see the cis white male as the hero throughout all these storylines. They're the only ones that get, what comes to mind is, especially when talking about the original Star Trek, they're the only ones that get the love story. Kirk got to kiss everybody. Sulu never got a love story on there. Uhura never got a love story. And it's definitely a rethinking and a retraining of ourselves.
Well, I think, but I also think we're talking very much about, when you talk about the original Star Trek, you're talking about a show with very lofty goals that was nevertheless written by men who fought in wars. So the focus is not just on the cisgendered white male, but it's also on the hierarchy of wartime units. It's like there's a captain and and if you look at American TV from 1950 to like 2004, it is being written by people who are primarily informed by that. Sure. So you're really looking at, that's why cops, doctors, and lawyers, you're really looking at a hegemony of that. And then, when you start getting into, so Star Trek, as laudable as the original series, it's laudable as its goals might have been racially, it's still a show from 50 years ago. I think when you start getting into Next Generation and Deep Space Nine and Enterprise and the new generation, sure. the newer, Discovery and Picard and Strange New Worlds, I think that's where we enter this very interesting sort of awkward period where people are keenly aware of the inchoate racism of the system. We're trying to put different things in there and different people and centering different people and all that, but you're still seeing not traces, big swaths of parts that are still sort of colonized. And it's sort of, when we talk about the centering of the cis white person, I think in 50 years, what is provided that we're not breaking down our furniture for kindling and avoiding the gangs.
50 years is generous, Javi.
Yeah, I know.
We'll be underwater. It'll be fine.
Yeah.
It's. I think the more important question is how do these tropes that are now damaging begin to kind of change, and how are we changing them as people of color who are writing in this genre, so that we're not having the same conversation in a little bit from now? That's a question to you.
I mean, that's a question that I struggle with all the time. And part of it, part of the answer I'm finding for myself is you have to reflect the times you're in. And that's granted, that's what they were doing in the 60s. That's what they were doing. They were reflecting that time, but they were reflecting, I think we talked about this when we had our sort of side group. They were reflecting the thinking that, well, if we pass a bunch of laws, everything's just going to be okay the day after the laws get passed. We pass the Civil Rights Act and then everything's cool. Everyone's fine. Everyone's now equal. And we just ignore that 400 years of oppression and violence happened. I feel like, as we are, as a culture, struggling to really reckon with what our past means and what our system, what we thought and how we acted, that I think is the part that a lot of science fiction likes to skip over, especially the inclusive stuff likes to skip right to everyone's getting along and everything's cool, and avoid the messy part of like, how did you actually fix that,
Well, and forgive me if everyone knows this story, and then I want to move on a little bit to Afrofuturism. But, and I think it's what set Lucas's going back to Star Wars for a sec, apart, the first three, and even the prequels to a certain extent, than the final three, because I was talking to a producer about a year and a half ago, and when they told me the actual story of Star Wars, it kind of just blew my mind, because apparently Lucas was asked to pitch Apocalypse Now. And he pitched Apocalypse Now as a version of rebels going against the Empire. And the rebels were the Viet Cong, and the Empire was the United States. And they said that no one would ever go for that. So he couched it into Star Wars. And I think he had an understanding of that the last three films didn't really understand at all or grasp.
So there's a lot the last three films didn't understand.
Yeah. True.
I was hoping to ask sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, no, go ahead, David.
Well, I was just hoping to ask the writers about sort of the generic tensions, or you kind of talked about how sci-fi is really interested in allegory, right? So, Blade Runner and slavery, X-Men, Star Trek about civil rights, any alien invasion film and colonialism, right? But that ends up centering whiteness because the allegory is sort of in the background. So do you find in the industry, when you want to actually make the subtext the text, there's a resistance there in the industry and in the genre itself, because they find that that'll be destructing.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to just pivot just a little bit to our other half of the topic. And Jay, Megan, talking about Afrocentrism, futurism. Sorry, so many isms. Afrofuturism. You know, what does it mean to both of you? Coming from an exec POV and from a storyteller POV.
Sure. I mean, I think that I don't know, Afrofuturism seems to be something that feels pretty pervasive in pop culture, at the very least as an aesthetic. You know, you have, you know, you have Janelle Monáe as an android, right? It's like pretty straightforward, right? It's like, how do we kind of imagine the future with Black people? And it's interesting because it's so often just drawing from this kind of like imagined African past, this Pan-African past. You know, you have like Eyes of Horus, and you have like feathers, and you have just these things that are very non-specific, right, but are African, right? And to some extent, I think, you know, understandably in America, Black people don't necessarily have the sense of written history because that was stolen away. You know, a lot of us don't know where we're from, quote unquote. But I always find that kind of interesting, and it's kind of like sometimes reading about Techno-Orientalism kind of put a lot about Afrofuturism into perspective for me, because if we're kind of comparing this Asia that's like technologically advanced but kind of soulless, right? Like it's lost its soul, it's lost its life, it needs a white dude to come and like re-energize it, right, and teach it some stuff. You kind of have this like over-idealized, warm heart of Africa kind of kumbaya stuff of like Wakanda, right? You have this
we have Wakanda
of, right, you know, you have this notion of these kind of powerful Black warriors. You have, there's that amazing Rihanna like Vanity Fair spread where she is just some kind of African space goddess that we don't have to define. So it's interesting the ways in which I think both of those deal with primitivism and modernity, but also, you know, what ends up being quote unquote good, right? And what ends up being moral in some ways. Kind of like this new way of just dealing with these old issues.
You brought up really interesting, Megan, with that, because the thing that struck me was, as I was just researching it, is that music seems to have embraced it a long time before, you know, TV and film came along. Like, you know, you had Missy Elliott in the 90s. You even, all the music videos, when we used to get music videos, you know, there was a lot of that already peppered in there that was just kind of relegated to music. Even like, you know, Beyonce had, you know, feminist Afrofuturism in it.
Well, I mean, my virtue of being on this panel is that we are adapting kindred, which is Octavia Butler, right? Who I think is seen as one of those kind of foremothers, if we use that word. I mean, it's interesting the ways in which it's also changed, in which it's changed as our visions of the future have changed, right? So, you know, kind of like everything else, right? It kind of morphs and evolves, and, you know, it, like you're saying, you're totally right. It's in visual art, it is in music, it is in photography, it is in film, it's in TV. It's this thing that I think oftentimes a lot of us see and don't necessarily analyze, because it kind of has become so much a part of pop culture, streetwear, fashion, whatever that ends up being. Jay, I keep interrupting you. I don't.
Oh, no. Because you're saying great things and like roll with it. I mean, when I look at it, because there's Afrofuturism, which is to me, because I'm a bit of a pedant, like there's a specific thing that it is, you know, that is based in African cultures and African imagery. And that is, you know, that is what, you know, Ryan Coogler leaned on for the vision of Wakanda, which is very sort of Pan-African. But I think, you know, what we haven't really developed, you know, to the Janelle Monáe of it, and to those images, we haven't really developed what an African American futurism is. Like what is a future that centers Black culture, that centers Black American culture, that is separate and distinct from Africa? You know, I mean, I feel like, you know, as a Black person, there is always that pressure of, you know, Africa's the homeland, Africa's the motherland. Your heart is really in Ghana, and that's where the real people are. But I don't know. I'm from America. This country is my home, And like, I think there's still a lot to be reckoned with that. But it again, when it comes to genre spaces, you get steamrolled by the notion that Megan brought up earlier, that neutral is white, just in a different color. And like,
if I can,
yeah.
I don't want to interrupt. Okay, it seems to me that, you know, for me, when you talk about Afrofuturism in terms of Wakanda, right? Mm-hmm. And specifically, you know, Wakanda was created also in the 60s or 70s, you know, as a response to blaxploitation and all of that. So you're also looking at a white person's kind of view of that world. And it seems to dovetail, actually, a lot of the Afrofuturism that I see seems to dovetail very nicely to me with the, I once read an essay where basically they said, like, they didn't want to see any more alien cultures based on feudal Japan, right? Because feudal Japan is the goat, because the Westerners don't understand feudal Japan at all. It's just not our thing. We're like over there, and that's what we're doing. But it seems to me that a lot of the Afrofuturism that we're seeing is actually sort of a cousin of that, even though it's being embraced by a lot of Black artists, because what it's leaning on is the idea that the tribal South is not understandable and it's de facto alien. Yeah. That seems to me to be sort of a big kind of basic concept. And then it's very interesting to me that then you look at Black artists glomming onto that, because let's face it, some of it is actually pretty cool. But then, and same with some of the stuff, you know, like you look at and kind of running with that, you know. So I mean,
think ideologically, in some ways, it's just the radical notion that like Black people survive. You know, in Afrofuturism, it's like, oh, they get to keep living and like keep going, and that feels really cool. You know, it's so basic in that way that it sounds like I'm being reductive, but I mean, I do think there's a lot. I do think that there's a lot of, you know, of that kind of very, you know, like primal feeling, like underneath that, right? It's like, how radical is it that you know, we can think about, there's a wonderful collection called How Long Till Black Future Month, and it's just like this notion of Black futurity, this notion of, rather than thinking about this, you know, mythological, invented, or, you know, for some people, you know, obviously well known but specific past, we are able to kind of like imagine a way forward, just because we know the past was kind of so shitty, you know, kind of where we can place ourselves.
And trying to embrace that. I mean, when I was on Supergirl the last season, we did an episode that was like our Black Lives Matter episode that was very much about race and color. And I think we got to do some interesting things, and I got a scene in there that I'm still, there's probably the one scene, and it's like 8 lines long, that I'm proudest of, because the scene, we have a character from the future, Brainiac 5, and the Black characters in the center of the episode ask him the question that would be the first question I would think a Black person would have asked someone from 300 years in the future, like, did we solve racism where you're from? And how did we do it? And his answer was, kind of. Like, we're better, but the scars persist. Because in my brain, I thought, like, if, like, Kunta Kinte showed up in my house right now and asked me, is 2022 better than 1805, I would say yes, but like, no. We have Beyonce, but they still shoot us in the streets. And I'm like, I feel like so much of the future, they don't want to wrangle with that it's going to take time, and that there's complications. And like, we just want to jump over to the part where everyone's cool with everyone and everyone shares just one culture. And, you know, apparently rap music ceased existing somewhere around 1999 because, except for Sabotage, no one listens to it in the future. So, you know, it's a whole thing.
Well, Jay, you had touched on this earlier too, and just coming off of what you were saying, you know, you had brought up earlier, when we see a lot of these future shows, especially 100, 150, 200 years in the future, it's like you had touched on it, laws have all been passed and everything's okay. We never see the in-between there, you know, we don't, you know. And Carlos, when we were doing our other conversation, you had touched on it too, you know, there is no post-sexism. There is, you know, we are past racism and sexism and, you know, homophobia, and everything's just great.
But we always seem to be meeting cultures, but we always seem to be meeting other cultures that have those things and fixing it.
Well,
that's interesting about
and I think that's Star Trek and fantasy in general that centers its stories on humans are essentially even us who has a really great Black female lead as our star. Like we are still centering on what is ostensibly the white cis male experience of the universe. Like humans are in there as the default experience, and aliens, you know, be it Ferengi or Klingons or orcs or elves, are there to exist as single facet mirrors to humanity, and not permitted to sort of exist in their own sort of personhood in the same way that humans are. Yeah.
No, it's true. We never see the flip side point of view.
Oh, but sorry, to the point that you're making, you know, I'll say that from experience, you know, some of those stories of, hey, let's try to do this thing of like improving how we do things in the Federation. We've canned some of those stories because as we get down in it, we're like, okay, so how are we doing it better when like the text is everybody's equal all the time, you know, like it's like everything is good, and I'm like, how do you do better? But it also leads to the question for me of how do subcultures exist within cultures that lack oppression? Like for me as a queer writer, you know, are there gay bars in Star Trek? I don't know. You know, like we've never seen one before, but like, is there a need for one in a future where, you know, probably everybody's a little bit pansexual, and you know, or should be.
Yep.
So yeah, you know, it's a hard question and a tough one because I don't know the answer to it, and I think really the only way it sort of grows as we get more, you know, writers of color, queer writers, women writers, disabled writers in the writers' room.
Can I ask why this idea persists of this post-racial utopian future? Because, you know, we saw an example of this.
Oh no.
Early rhetoric about the internet was that everyone was going to be judged basically on merit. We're not going to see race, we're not going to see gender, anything like that. And you go to any YouTube section today and you realize, oh my God, it's much more toxic. Race does matter. And that dream of a cyberspacian utopia never came to fruition. But despite that example, this sci-fi dream of this meat space or transcending the meat space to cyberspace persists.
I honestly think though that I'm sorry to because I like, okay, so it seems to me that a great deal of that has to do with a lot of that culture being manufactured in the United States, because in spite of the inchoate racism of this country, in spite of the way that this, you know, all of the original sins of this country, all of the crap they've done, I feel like the United States generally believes that it goes out and improves everyone's life, especially in the post-World War II period, you know, which is when you start seeing a lot of this science fiction being made and a lot of these concepts of utopian futures, the Federation, you know, even the Lensman, you know, from which is pre-war, but you're still talking about a very American idea, you know, like I think when we went west, it, you know, I don't think the Americans saw it as we're going to murder everybody. I think they saw it as we're going to make this land better. And we're going to bring our values to people. We're going to export democracy. So it seems to me that that trope is so cemented in our self-concept as the ones who figured it out and went out and improved everyone's life with American democracy, you know?
Well, that even seems to go, oh, I'm sorry, Jay, go ahead.
I was just saying, and the trope that America is like all of these sort of post-racial, post-oppression concepts really are baked in that post-World War II sense of America is the land of the free. Here in America, we are all equal and you all rise by your merits or fall by your merits. And, you know, that's why that's the goal, right? The goal is this classless, raceless society where everyone is equal. But of course, it was all represented by straight white men in charge of everything, giving the implication that when everything is equal, they'll still rise to the top. you know. And I feel like it's a lot like frankly most of American politics, which is we're the land of the free and all of this, but we are 100% run and operated on oppression, and the country doesn't know how to operate otherwise, you know.
Well, not to get religion in this for a second, but
no.
you know,
we got politics.
We're getting, I'm about to throw it in on the fire. It really also, it just reminds me of how Christianity really came converting everybody, and you're a savage if you don't convert to Christianity and everything. And you know, you saw that was, you know, that was accepted in early TV, calling Native American savages because they didn't have Jesus. And you know, that mentality seems to transcend all the way, you know, how the United States views itself in expansion, honestly.
I mean, thinking of Techno-Orientalism and Afrofuturism, it's kind of like the you can't win, right? I mean, obviously there is a long history of like kind of putting Black folks and Asian folks on two sides of a coin in American culture and myth making, and you know, it's all very fucked up. But it's interesting in that what you're saying, especially when you think of it like in this moral sense, right? Like they do become these kind of diametric opposites, right? Like one that's like very clean and safe and no soul, and one that is like all soul and all color, light, whatever, you know. It just kind of very much does reflect kind of the ways in which, I don't know, America tries to teach us to think about ourselves very often. I find that interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, we know how we're portrayed. I want to just go around for a sec, and then I want to get more into the solution and hear a little bit about kindred. What bothers you the most about how we're portrayed in film or TV and sci-fi? What, like, just like, what makes you cringe these days that you see?
I think until Rogue One came out, pretty much all of it in terms of the Latinos. I mean, you know, we finally got some, you know, I literally, I know that this story has been also told by others, but like I cried in the theater when I realized, holy crap, I've been sitting here and there's been an hour of a Star Wars movie with a dude that talks like a Mexican. Best thing ever.
Rogue One is the best of the new Star Wars movies. So don't argue with me.
But I guess what I'm but then you look at The Last Jedi, they finally get a Puerto Rican in there, and he's of course the asshole who betrays everybody, who's a fucking amoral, lazy nihilist, you know. I mean, I think like you know, I think for Latinx culture, there is a huge like entrance that we have to make into the world of science fiction, because we really haven't. You know, and it's very hard for me to sit here I mean, look at where I'm talking to you from. I'm a fan, okay? And it's hard for me to say, oh, this was the great Latinx sci-fi. Wait.
Yeah, and I thought it's interesting how often, you know, with a Latino lead, the Mandalorian keeps his helmet on.
Well, and I mean, I was just thinking about it as we were talking through this thing. I don't even think we have a term. Like, there's just nothing out there.
I read two short stories.
We don't even have a label. So
I read 2 short stories in my entire life with Indigenous people in space.
Yeah.
Here, like they are of the land. They stay on the land. They don't.
They
like
don't
what?
No ships for them.
As a colonial subject of the United States, I guess for, you know, us Puerto Ricans, it's just whatever America is doing.
Yeah. I mean, that's what's frustrating. I mean, the most frustrating is just the narrowness. I mean, I think, you know, is the narrowness of the view of the world, the narrowness of the view of the experience, and the possibilities that, like, you know, and it's all of it. Like, it is the like lack of, you know, the lack of Black history in the future. Black history has ceased to exist except for the occasional name check of Martin Luther King. It's as though no other important Black person ever existed again. And like, as much as I do love the multiculturalism of things like Star Trek, it is the sort of erasing of those cultural differences and those cultural experiences and that sort of homogeny and homogenizing of culture, because the cultures, even as an American, like I still have a distinct culture that I can access. I still have a distinct history that is ours, and losing that just seems like you're cutting yourself off, you know?
I often wonder, though, a lot of what we're talking about has to do with American pop cultural hegemony, especially in the second half of the 20th century, which is a time when the United States, I keep saying America as a word, the United States had the technology to respond and to continue to kind of do this, a lot faster than, say, the Roman Catholic Church did in the Middle Ages. So one of the things you're seeing is that the culture that holds hegemony over the world is truly global. And even though it's influencing other cultures there, Americans, the culture machine in the United States tends to look at minorities as blocks. They don't look at, for example, like to them as a Puerto Rican, I'm probably no different from an El Salvadorian or a Chilean or what have you. That's most people as a Puerto Rican don't know what the hell I am and or what the hell the place I came from is. So that's neither here nor there. But it's this thing where, like, as David said at the beginning of this, Techno-Orientalism migrates from Japan to from Tokyo to Shanghai seamlessly, right? Because Asian is perceived as one gigantic block. So is Hispanic. So is all of this stuff. So my hope is that as the United States in its current incarnation begins to lose cultural currency, and other cultures begin to gain greater access to the technology that is used to kind of gain cultural hegemony, that you don't just see the United States as influence fragmenting, but also the idea that as other cultures get the capacity to make television or films on the level that the United States has for the last 75 years, that you will see more individual cultures. Because when I also say, like, I want to see Latinx science fiction, that doesn't mean I want to see Aztecs in space. See, I mean, it'd be great. I would love to see it, but it's not necessarily the thing I'm clamoring for, because that's not my people, Yeah. So I think it also, so when I say, I'm really happy to see Latinx people in Star Wars, I say it because I just like seeing people who look like me in the fantasy universe I grew up wanting to live in,
Right.
Sure. And Megan, I want to pivot for a second, and since we're kind of getting into how do we, make it better, I want to talk to you a little bit about Kindred.
I can attempt to make a segue. I can attempt to make a graceful segue from something Jay said, which is, a lot of the necessity, showing Afrofuturism might necessitate kind of ignoring actual Black history in America. I mean, what I think is pretty revolutionary about Kindred is that it makes that, the text, like so Kindred, novel by Octavia Butler, that I'm working on developing here at FX. We are filming now, I think this minute. Really exciting. Octavia Butler being a Pasadena writer, a Black American woman. And I mean, I read Kindred when I was 12, which now blows my mind. I mean, like, I was like, oh my God, it's such a fun love story. They're time traveling. Like, I was 12, but it's been my favorite book since then. And it's one of those that I can genuinely return to. And there is something different about it each time. But something I've been thinking about a lot recently is just, it's a Afrofuturist novel that takes place in the past, right? It is in some ways, it is the fantasy that Dana, who's our lead, can go back and kind of literally fill in these spaces in the family tree in her family Bible, right? Like, part of that is the fantasy, but then you also have to deal with the reality of what, the transatlantic slave trade meant for many Black Americans, which is that, the way many of us got here was through sexual coercion, was through violence, was, she discovers when she's on the Wayland plantation that she is actually there to save her white ancestor, and comes to this decision of, do I allow him to rape the woman that was my great grandmother? So it is a deeply fucked up, deeply American, deeply, like, interesting, wonderful story. Obviously it's a long season. It's ongoing. We have Brandon Jacobs Jenkins adapting it. It will keep going for a while. Let's all knock wood, so we aren't getting quite there anytime soon. But it's been interesting thinking about, this writer who is interested very much in visions of the future. Her, kind of most seminal work is this one that is, takes place mostly in 1815.
Very cool. I can't wait. Carlos, Jay, how, your guys are phenomenal storytellers. How do we make it? How do we change it? How do we pivot the future to make it more inclusive or tell stories that are more personal to us, you know, that are still, you know, set in the future and everything.
I mean, this isn't a solution. It's just something I'm fond of saying, is that I think we're going to know true equality when people of color, when queer people, when women can create art as mediocre as some of the art that we see out there right now, and still get to go to work the next day. And you know, and I think that, but it's also in the same thing, like misbehave, fuck up. Like we are, you know, like we try not to be monoliths, but unfortunately for us, when we are out here creating, we have to stand a cut above our white peers, because our success and failure reverberates throughout our communities. And if you're intersectional, that's even worse or better for, you know, depending on how it shakes out for you.
Yeah, I mean, we've got to. It's being a Black artist. I can't speak to any other identity, because that's
sure, of course not.
Being, you know, a Black artist, a Black TV writer in this field that is, you know, one part art, one part commerce, you know, that has its feet in both those worlds. You have to. There's a very complicated dance of moving between those worlds and navigating those worlds, and like being a good employee as well as doing everything you can to center your experience and to center stories that come from your experience. And it gets frustrating because sometimes you're like, I have to, in a way, it feels like I have to explain to this other person that I am a human being who has human feelings, and that I respond in certain ways to stimuli like everyone else. But you also want it to be authentic and real, and you want it to feel not just genuine, but you want to reach people with it. And I find the more that as I get older and sort of move in this, the more I can center those experiences and center the experiences I had as a youth and as an adult, and like really center that point of view more than trying to educate anyone on it, and just sort of saying, you know what, I'm just going to tell this story about this family that looks like this, that acted like mine, and they're going to get on board or they're not.
I mean, I think the idea of like anybody's story being able to be entertaining as well is really exciting. You know, it's not solely trauma based, it's life based. Yep. And it is, you know, especially thinking about genre works, it's like, right, they're meant to be fun. Nobody watches a boring show, like they get canceled. Like, you know, we are here to, as much as it's art commerce, it's also entertainment, like being able to have that. Being able to have that range, I think, is very exciting.
Yep.
I know a lot of writers are reaching for.
Jay just spoke like my dream. All I want to see is Lost in Space with a Black family, not just the Black daughter. Robinsons, come on, they can go to space.
I gotta say though, I'm still stuck on this cyborg cowboy selling human meat hot dogs. Like I would watch that show. I would write that show.
I would be him.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like, and that's the other thing that for me, it's also like mash crap up, mash it together, like sort of crash the cars together and see what shakes out. And, you know, even to the trauma of it, this is a bizarre thought that has just come to me, but it's like everyone has trauma and everyone has very similar trauma, you know, like it doesn't, my family trauma is mostly like difficult parent family trauma. I don't have to, you don't always have to go to the like, oh, I was, you know, people threw stuff at me because I was Black or I was an outsider or whatever. It's just, my family was weird and fucked up. And you can just let your families be weird and fucked up. And, you know, especially as Black artists, you know, there's all that pressure of excellence and doing it for the race. And sometimes just be like, sometimes people were just fucked up, y'all. And it's okay.
I think it's really interesting though, because I feel like, you know, earlier on we talked about, you know, when will it all be fixed, or, you know, and usually my answer for that is when the last person dies who was made to feel bad by, you know, their pop culture. But it's actually not even that. It's when the last trope dies.
Yeah.
You know, it's the death of the last person who was made to feel bad, but then the death of the storytelling tools and that's probably a few decades further on. so I think, Jay, like, it's really important what you're saying about mixing it up, because one of the things that I feel like we need to accept as artists, and even though we may complain about both shows we work on and other people's shows, is that no one's show is going to be the final word on anything. You know, and that has been such a problem with things, especially led by minority. You know, you look at a movie like Edward James Olmos's American Me, which he made 30 years ago, I think. And it's one of those things where, like, that movie, you can tell the strain of trying to be every story for everyone in every way, to trying to be definitive. And I think, as you say, it's not just about excelling, it's also about, there's a huge pressure on us to be definitive about what it is that we need to say about our culture, so that the people watching TV can just be done with it, you know? And the thing is, there is no be done with it, you know? So our best bet to move the culture forward is to do exactly what Jay just said, which is mix it up, you know? And I think it was Salman Rushdie who said that is how newness enters the world, you know? The remixing, the putting together of things that maybe seem disparate. And that is the kind of newness that's ultimately going to move the needle away from, you know, it all sucking. But not, I don't think any one of us can expect to create the work of Latinx futurism, Afro-Futurism, you know, Asian-centered futurism. That's going to be the last word on it, because anything we make at this point in history is going to be problematic. Straight up, no chaser, no matter where you're from.
Can I ask a question of David, maybe? I'm curious, do you think, or I mean, this is kind of from more of an academic point of view rather than necessarily like a practical, tell us how to do this now, but do you think that there is redeeming some of these tropes? Do you, like, does it, in terms of the discourse, is it kind of like, let us now erase all visions of Tokyo, like fake Tokyo in sci-fi, and, you know, do something else? Is it kind of like, do we just need to educate people as to what they're seeing and experiencing, and, you know, kind of how that's working? Is there kind of a point of view that thinkers tend to lean on?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think this dovetails nicely with Colin's question and Javi's this point earlier. What I'm starting to see now, what gives me hope, are rooms like this where writers of color are really engaged with these ideas and bringing a sort of critical eye to the genre. But what I'm seeing now, particularly with regards to films tackling Techno-Orientalism, is a real subversion of the tropes, right? Being sneaky about it, using it as a Trojan horse to speak back to all the preceding science fiction films that have kind of hammered this home. So the most recent one is Kogonada's After Yang. I don't know if anyone saw that one from A24. But it was, when I first saw the trailer, I thought, holy shit, what is this guy doing? It looks like every sci-fi trope I've ever seen with regards to Techno-Orientalism. But when you watch the film, you see that he is being very, very sneaky and speaking back and hollowing that trope out and deconstructing it and shoving it back in our faces in a very subtle way. I don't know if you've ever seen this film, but it's very, you know, kind of elegiac. So what I would say that it's not necessarily about an obliteration of those tropes, right? There's supposed to be a cross-cultural dialogue, right? It's a back and forth. It's a sort of engagement that happens with respect to Javi's point, right? And that's what really is interesting to me.
Kind of allowing that space for the other side to speak, kind of as you were saying, right? It's not just the West taking this, speaking about it. It's being able to go back and forth in that way.
I think that as
and to your earlier point.
Sorry, go ahead. No, I was going to
very quickly. Just very quickly to Megan's earlier point about Afrofuturism, sort of the implicit critique of Afrofuturism as being sort of one dimension on overcorrection that centers white history still as sort of a binary, right? Still, you know, giving space for Afrofuturism to tell that story and then expand iteratively beyond that is really important.
Yep.
I can't even believe we've been going almost an hour. I could keep going with this. We have a couple of questions I just wanted to throw out there and see what you think. David, I'll start with you. We have a question here that says, would you please describe the Asian image of the futuristic West?
I'm not an East Asian studies expert, so I can't speak to that. I'm not, you know, Japan's expert or Korea's expert. So my specialty is in Asian American studies, so squarely in the American context. But what I can tell you is, I think I kind of alluded to this earlier. Javi had asked me a question, is that there are adoptions of that aesthetic, but recontextualized for a very specific, say, Japan purpose or Korea purpose or China purpose. So there's a lot of interesting sci-fi coming out of China right now that's really booming, and I haven't studied it. I don't really know much about it, but I know that it is really kind of making waves in the culture and in academia, and I'm really curious to see what that looks like.
Well, I'm sure Benioff and Weiss will do a great job with the three-body problem.
Okay.
What I was going to say is that, look, I think we as minority writers have a responsibility to try to speed up the evolution of these tropes. You know, we're talking about how, you know, you bring your stuff in and you kind of keep advancing these things. So I think that that's a big part of what we need to be doing, and which many of us are doing.
I really agree with that. You know, there's always that thing when there's ever like the Black version of this that drops, you know, and eventually in the Twitter, someone's like, why aren't we creating our own stuff? And I think that there should be one, room for both. Mm-hmm. And two, to your point, like the way to change those tropes is to literally change those tropes and to like meaningfully change those tropes. You know, like one of the things that's been kicking around in my head is like, what would the Scooby Gang look like if they were Black? If they were Black modern teenagers, and what would that look and feel like if instead of, you know, it was a Range Rover, and like, you know what I mean? Like what would that be? Yeah. And how would that exist in the world? And what would that mean to people? Because it is about, part of this is about reflecting a reality to people in a way, particularly for people who are oppressed in this country, as like an antidote to the gaslighting of like, your existence is valid, your feelings, your life is real, and here other people can see it and understand that you are a person with feelings, you know, and not just a fucking police blotter.
There is like no bigger high than someone telling you how much it meant to see themselves represented on screen in a way that, like, that is genuine or real, or even just a shade better than it was last time.
Yeah.
Like it means a lot. And I mean, like, I'm still seeing things now where I'm like, holy shit, I could have used that as a little gay kid too.
Yep.
Oh man, it's rough. But it's so powerful when we get to see ourselves. I mean, like exactly what Javi said. I had the same reaction in Rogue One of like, holy shit. Like, someone who sounds like people in my family is in space, and you know, like that's why, like I love that we have Wilson Cruz on there, who is a, you know, hugely prominent queer activist, and you know, a fantastic Latino actor up there being Dr. Culber, and that role is, you know, it's so great, but it's hard to find Latinos in Canada, apparently. So we've been told, because like I keep saying, can we get this guest actor Latino? And I'm like, oh, it's okay. It's, you know, we cast pretty diverse up there, but it's really hard, like, to find a Latino actor to get in just a, you know, bit speaking role in Toronto.
Try finding an entire like hospital full of Black people in Vancouver. It happened. Didn't even come close. They tried. They really tried. Bless their hearts.
Oh, well, I have a second question here. It's coming from a writer who's white, and they're trying to build a dystopian future in a responsible way. So they want to know how do you feel? It's a multi-tiered question. How do you feel about the depiction of racism itself in sci-fi narratives?
I mean, to your point, to your question before, if there is anything that's going to make me cringe that I do not really want to see anymore, or as little as possible, is, as much as I do love allegory, but is, you know, this alien race represents some race or some culture, and like, it's just, let cultures be cultures. Let them be what they are, as opposed to sort of aping Japanese culture or Black culture or whatever. You know what I mean? Like that stand-in, that one-to-one stand-in is pretty tiring, you know?
I think that, I mean, as a good example, I think N.K. Jemisin does that really well, is portraying racial difference, racial, class, gender difference without necessarily transcribing like one-to-one, like the experiences of Black folks, Asian folks, whatever, you know, in her kind of wild multiracial worlds. It takes more effort, right? It takes way more imagination to figure out how all of that would fit together, but I don't know, I think that's just pretty good.
Do you think that with the, I hope I'm getting this right, do you think that with the, you know, we talked about the laws earlier where everything's erased. Do you think that as a white writer, that is just erased, kind of just speaking to white discomfort with white supremacy?
Yes.
All right, moving on.
I mean, I do. Like, it's like, you know, when you put it out there kind of like that, when you look at science fiction media that has been centered on that the whole time, with all of the problems that tend to make people uncomfortable, especially white people, like, how is it in this country a worse offense to call someone racist than it is to actually be racist? You know? So like it's a hard needle to thread, because like I don't think that, like, you know, it's a thing that I think that all of us need to reckon with, whether we are white, Latino, Asian, all of us. But I think it's a tricky thing, because like it depends on the type of dystopia you're trying to present. Like, and you have to ask yourself as a writer, why do I want to present this dystopia with racism in it, like as a thing? And I mean, I think, you know, it is a tricky needle to thread, because it is, on the other hand, if you completely acknowledge, you know, just get rid of it, it is kind of erasure in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, you have.
Oh, just going to add to that. There's a mechanism in science fiction that really kind of has been taking off recently. I don't know if you watched the Scarlett Johansson Ghost in the Shell or Altered Carbon, but there's like, in those shows, the white body was actually, the person inside is supposed to be Asian, right? But the show or the movie explained that away and said, oh no, in this future we can change bodies, and so race, we don't have to talk about race doesn't really matter, but the protagonist just happens to be this white dude or white woman, right? And so it's very convenient.
Yeah, I mean, I think as all of us, and this is true for everyone, you have to really examine your own prejudices, examine your own preconceived notions. You know, speaking of kindred, you know, even as a black person in America, but, you know, raised in the culture that we're raised in and raised in the world that we're raised in, it really wasn't until reading Kindred that I fully processed that slaves were people. Because even in our language, we use language like, oh, they were granted their rights, so they became people in 1865. But then you realize, no, they were always people. And then you have to go down that rabbit hole of like, what is that experience of being a person in that? And that's the thing that calls bullshit on everything everyone says about slave owners, because they were looking at people and they knew they were dealing with people.
One interesting thing that, I mean, not only in the scripts, but in like, you know, our production documents for this, like we don't use the word slaves. It's like enslaved people. And I was like, the fact that blew my own mind.
Wow.
Like, you know, it's like, it's like, oh, right. Turns out that it's like a state of being, not an identity. Like, interesting. Like, you know, I mean, like I felt so, my assistant knew this. I did not. I felt so old, but like, you know, it was one of those things that just like, right, how do we think about
exactly? And like, I feel like when you're creating these future worlds and you're dealing with that, you have to make sure you're dismantling all that stuff inside of you, because otherwise, yeah, you're going to wind up leaning on racist, sexist, homophobic tropes to tell stories, because that's what we have, that's built into the genre. And until you really accept that those other people are people, you can't get past it. It's like, I play a fair amount of D&D, and like the revolution in D&D when they've moved away from race-based characteristics. Exactly. From the idea that like an orc is born with a set of intrinsic personality traits that they have no control over.
Well,
it's wild to be like, wait, no, that's not how it works, guys.
Well, it's as speaking as someone who like writes and designs for stuff like that, it's amazing that it's only been this last year that they've codified in the rules that they were getting rid of some of the bioessentialism in character creation. Like in 2021, and the game has been around since the 70s. Like,
yeah, exactly. Yeah, even the idea of different races. Like, yeah, please do. I'm down.
Great. And here's the kicker part of the question. How would you like to see the depiction of racism change in the types of sci-fi stories you commonly see? Anyone want to take that?
You know, look, I think I've seen a bunch of Star Trek episodes where like, you know, like the guy's half black and half white, you know, and like
a bunch.
And then in Blade Runner 2049, where like the guy goes, "Fuck off, skin job," to the other guy. But I don't know, like the depiction of racism. You mean like really accusatory,
how would you like to see
angry
the depiction of racism change in the type of sci-fi stories you commonly
Yes,
see?
I would like to see it first.
Yes.
Yes, I'd like to see it.
Yep.
And then I'd like to see it change.
I would like
That's
to see
how I would like to see it change. I'd like to see it first.
Yep.
I'd like to see people actually try to address complicated issues of systemic racism that have nuance and subtlety, and it's not just half of Frank Gorshin is black, the other half is white, and then the other Frank Gorshin, half of it is white, but the opposite half, it's racism.
Yep.
No, I mean, let's actually see it portrayed in a way that speaks to the experience that minority people have had in a sensitive, nuanced way, and then let's change it.
The very best episode, in my opinion, of Star Trek, and the one that addresses this head on, is Far Beyond the Stars. And it's like in the head, basically a time travel episode to actually directly address these in a major way. But it's absolutely stunning. I mean, you could show that episode to anybody, and they will come away from it feeling hollowed out.
Yep.
Because, oh man, nothing has changed. And I just wrote some Star Trek adventure stuff, and I watched that episode recently, and I got paid 1 cent more a word than Benny did in the 50s. So it hasn't changed the writers much.
But you're also, by the way, and you're talking about an episode of Deep Space Nine. That means that was produced in 1998, 1999.
Yeah.
So we're talking about 23 years ago, and that's the thing that comes to mind. I mean, I think of maybe Children of Men, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's really hard. Like, I mean, to look at things that are doing some of this well, ironically, it is Star Trek, but it's the Lower Decks is, I think, doing a lot of these conversations and a lot of this depiction of how that society actually functions for the people in it, and centering those experiences very, very well, and centering, you know, to Carlos's point, like Beckett Mariner on that show is gleefully pansexual, and no one cares. Like, and it comes up all the time, and it's great how they've sort of like just been like, this is just how it is in a really nice way. But yeah, I'm with Javi. Like, let's actually see real, legitimate racism, and not just like the abuses of racism. Like, I don't need to see, you know, that, but just let's have a real conversation about what it is and how it functions in a meaningful way.
I want to, we're getting near the end of it, but I still want to throw this out because it's something that interests me. What storylines do you see that you would love to see out there, but they're still not just they're not being considered by the powers that be? Anything?
I think I'm the powers that be in this equation, so I'm
Hello,
gonna pass.
power that be.
I mean, it's not so much like, listen, I mean, I think all of us have a bunch of things that we could pitch you right now that I would love to see in the world. But yeah, I'm just looking, like, what I'm interested in, at least my project right now that I'm sort of working on in general, this is not just any specific thing, is how do I represent as accurately as I can what right now feels like, without it just being transcription. Like, what are we wrestling with? What are those questions? Like, where does capitalism fit in all of this? How are we trying to dismantle these things? And I think the more that the more that I try to do that, the more I try to, like, both personally, like, what does it feel like to be me right now, as well as what does this world feel like? That's what I feel like I'm missing. I feel like a lot of sci-fi is giving me what the world felt like in 1975, and that's not what's now. Not the kindred, flash. That, you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
I think, like, to Javi's point, it's not. I mean, for me, it's not necessarily about what stories I want to see. I just want to see myself in them, both as a Latino and as a queer person, where, like, dealing with the very real fear that we may not see ourselves represented in a few years or alive.
Yeah.
It is really like a worry of mine that, like, the industry is going to kind of flip back in the other direction depending on the political winds, and we won't see those stories be told. And
I don't think you should worry about it. I think you should count on it. I think that is very much what we're up against.
Mm-hmm.
This country is I think that we need to be as fatalistic as possible, so that what we fight for as hard as possible. I don't think I've tried to sell a pilot in the last 15 years that didn't have a multi-ethnic cast, regardless of, most of my pilots have female leads at this point, because I know that's a narrow end of a wedge that I can get in. I tried doing a pilot with a Puerto Rican lead in 2002, and I was told it was impossible. It didn't happen. We couldn't do it. We could not find a Latinx actor that 5 studio executives and a network president could imagine as a series lead. That's slowly changing, but I mean, honestly, we just need to assume that this country is going to be in the worst possible place and write to that. And we have to try to sell ballsy. We need to try to write ballsy, and we need to basically leave it all on the field right now, because what we pitch now and what we write now is what's hopefully going to inspire people to try to take some opposition to what's going on.
Yep.
Because there is definitely a group that's trying to rise, and then there's another group, I would say more on our side. Yeah, they're so tired of hearing it, they don't want to hear it anymore. So they're kind of they're trying to put their heads in the sand as well. So Javi, I think it's a good point.
Nope, don't let them. Just comfort the comfortable. That's a big part of our job.
I think that's the most telling thing, one of the most telling things I've heard all night. Yeah, just comfort this is no time to be comfortable.
Nope.
I wonder what that feels like, being comfortable.
You know what? As somebody who passes for white and has for part of his career, honestly, it engenders a great deal of guilt when you figure out what you've been doing.
Yeah.
And it engenders a great deal of, and I'm not saying have sympathy for me, but I'm saying, like, as somebody, like, I look at my work in the 90s, when I was not, before I really got religion about being Puerto Rican, and knowing that I'm in this country, and knowing that people really do think there's a difference between me and them. And there's a lot of that work that I took the check, I got to stand by it, but I'm not proud of, because it reflects things that maybe didn't have to be that way if I had been a little more militant about it.
Right.
So I find myself playing catch up, and it's not a place I like to be in. So that's an answer to your question, but not one that I expect you to have any sympathy for me for. Just sort of.
But I mean,
no.
But there is that dance of, like, you can't help anyone if you don't have a job. You can't help anyone if you're not getting hired. Well, and, like, as shitty as the system is, you have to find your way to work within it and with it and through it, and then just fucking subvert it from within. You know?
Can I say one thing in apropos of what you just said? I know that I talk a lot, and I apologize if I've.
No.
I just worked on a mini room for Disney Plus. Okay. Every member of the staff was a person of color. Every writer, every person writing on the show was either Hispanophone or Latinx. Our showrunner is half Black, half Spanish. So she's not exactly from the Latin American world, but she's somebody who comes from a Hispanic culture. And the show was a show based on Latin American fantasy mythology, and it's sort of a Harry Potter-like fantasy show taking place entirely in a world where it's not just Latin American, it's that the different kind of sort of nationalities of the different mythologies are actually kind of identified in it.
Mm-hmm.
And I will tell you that I want to just end my part of this in an optimistic note. In 27 years in this business, I never thought that room could exist. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly I'm in it, and somebody was asking me about the room, and I said, "This room is like somebody in the room was saying, when is there going to be justice?" And I remember saying to that person, I said, "This room is justice."
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I feel in that regard. I have not been in a ton of rooms. You two have a much longer and more storied career than I so far, hopefully. But I've been very lucky in that I've worked almost exclusively for queer or person of color or queer person of color showrunners, because that has made being a voice and an advocate to get rid of the tropes, as obvious saying, a lot easier and a lot more comfortable for someone who's coming in at a much lower level.
Well, and one of the you reminded me, Javi, of when I was watching Disney Plus last year, and it has the sci-fi in it. The Falcon and the Winter Soldier, Anthony Mackie's speech at the end about, will America accept a Black Captain America? It brought a tear to my eye, because it wasn't just the show. It was speaking to the audience. Will you accept a Black Captain America?
You know what I thought was even more revolutionary about that? Like the second to last episode. You know how the second to last episode always had the huge cliffhanger? Everybody's gonna die. It's the second to last episode. Join us. Second to last episode of Falcon and the Winter Soldier ended on a barbecue.
Yes.
And I thought it was like the most subversive thing ever, because I literally was like, oh my God, I literally just get to hang with these guys I love. Yep. Thank you, Malcolm Spellman. Like, it was so awesome.
No, it was bomb. It was bomb. Well, you guys, this has been wonderful. I hope everyone watching this takes away something from this. Take away anything, discomfort the comfortable. I believe Sanaz wants to say a couple of things, and then we're going to wrap it. But thank you so much. I learned so much from you guys tonight. You guys are awesome.
Thank you.
I just wanted to say thank you so much. This has been the best panel to date that we've ever co-hosted at the Guild, and you all were incredibly brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, and everyone have a great evening. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.